Today, we're really plunging into the core principles of building successful startups. We're drawing directly from some key insights shared by Paul Graham in the sources we've looked at.
That's right. Yeah, we've gone through a good amount of material, essays, notes, his observations on what actually makes startups tick. And our goal here in this deep dive is really to help you, if you're a founder, an entrepreneur, maybe a CEO, or a leader, to kind of cut through all the noise.
Yeah, get to the heart of it. What's the DNA of rapid growth? What's the stuff that truly matters when you're, pushing that boulder uphill?
Exactly. Think of it as trying to distill years of pretty hard-won wisdom into things you can actually use, actionable nuggets.
Okay, so we're not just summarizing here. We're trying to unpack the underlying logic.
Yeah.
So where do we even start? What even is a startup according to this framework?
Well, the fundamental definition, based on the material, it's not just, oh, it's a new company. That's too broad. A startup has this really specific trait. It's a company designed to grow fast.
Designed to grow fast. Okay, that sounds simple, but it makes a big difference, doesn't it? It separates it from, say, a local restaurant or a lifestyle business. The whole point is different.
Exactly. The intent, the structure, it's all geared towards speed. And from that core idea, you get the most critical principle. Growth is basically the only essential thing for a startup.
The single essential thing.
Yeah, it's the #1 metric. It's the main goal. Everything else you hear about startups, the advice, the challenges, the cool stories, it all really stems from this central push for rapid growth.
So if I'm a founder, that's my compass then. Every decision I should be asking, does this drive growth?
Pretty much. The sources argue that if you can get growth happening, almost everything else tends to sort itself out. It's like a magic problem solver. It attracts talent, it brings in funding, it gives you breathing room options. It's the engine.
And what does that growth usually look like? Is it just, boom, hockey stick from day one?
Not usually, no. The typical path for successful startups, as described in these sources, it often follows more of an S-curve.
An S-curve. Okay.
Yeah, so you have that initial phase, which can be pretty painful, honestly. Slow growth, maybe zero growth, while you're just trying to figure out if people even want your thing and how to reach them.
Right, the flat bit at the bottom.
Exactly. Then, if you crack that code, if you find product market fit and a way to reach users, you hit an inflection point. And then you get into that period of really rapid, sometimes almost exponential growth.
That's the dream, right? The steep part of the S.
That's the part everyone focuses on. And then, eventually things slow down, the company matures, maybe you hit market saturation, competitors catch up. You enter the flatter top part of the S. But for a startup, the whole game is hitting and maximizing that steep, rapid growth phase.
Okay, so how do I know if I'm actually on that curve, especially early on? What's the number I should be, obsessing over?
The single most important number, according to these sources, your growth rate. And crucially, you need to measure it weekly.
Weekly. Wow, that sounds really frequent. Why not monthly or quarterly, bigger companies?
Because the whole pace of a startup is different. Weekly growth, and you measure it using revenue or maybe active users, it just forces you to confront reality, right now, constantly.
Okay.
The sources suggest aiming for, say, 5 to 7% weekly growth. That's considered good. If you hit 10% or more weekly, that's exceptional.
Let's just pause on that. 10% weekly. If you start with, 100 users, compounding that.
It gets big fast. Think about it. Week after week, that 10% adds up incredibly quickly.
Yeah, I did a quick calculation earlier. 100 users at 10% weekly is over 14,000 in a year. Almost 2 million in 2 years. That's wow.
It's the power of compounding. And focusing on hitting that specific weekly number does something really important for founders.
Yeah.
It takes this huge, vague, scary problem of build a successful company and turns it into a very focused optimization problem. Okay, how do I make this number go up this week? Just this week.
Okay, so it gives you something concrete, something immediate to shoot for every single Monday morning, like a mini goal.
Exactly. And that intense focus, that almost obsessive drive to hit the weekly number, that's what pushes founders to actually do things, to experiment, to talk to users, to try stuff out. You don't find the path to growth by just thinking about it. You find it by acting and iterating based on that weekly feedback loop.
Okay, so growth is the target. Weekly growth is the pulse. But like you said, you can't grow something nobody wants. So how do you even figure out what to build in the first place?
Right. And this brings us straight to that Y Combinator motto, which is presented as just bedrock. Make something people want.
Sounds so simple. Almost too simple.
It does, but it's cited as the absolute core of success. And the flip side. That's the #1 reason most startups fail. They don't make something people actually want.
You can have the best team, Tons of cash, a huge market on paper. But if the core thing isn't desired,
You're toast. A startup has no inertia, no brand loyalty, no existing base to fall back on. You have to offer something users genuinely actively want.
but finding that's the hard part, isn't it? If it were easy or obvious what people wanted, someone probably would have built it already.
Totally. It's hard. And the sources suggest that great startup ideas often don't begin as these perfectly detailed, rigid business plans. They often start more like questions.
Questions, how so?
Well, instead of saying, we are building the ultimate online collaboration tool, maybe you start by asking, could we make it simpler for small teams to just coordinate tasks online?
So framing it as a question keeps you flexible. It lets you explore, adapt based on what you learn from users instead of being locked into your first guess.
Exactly. And one really powerful way to find those unmet needs, those good questions, is often by solving problems that you yourself or maybe your friends are facing.
Living in the future, sort of.
Kind of. If you're experiencing a frustration, maybe you're seeing a need that others will feel soon too. Think about the classic examples. Wozniak wanting his own computer.
Right, when there were giant mainframes.
Or Zuckerberg wanting to connect with friends online at Harvard. Or Larry and Sergey needing a better way to search the web. They were their own first customers.
So they deeply understood the problem because they had the problem. That gives you a huge head start in knowing what good looks like.
Definitely. But what if you don't have that perfect scratch your own itch idea? What if you're building for, say, nurses or truck drivers and you're not one?
Yeah, what then?
Then you absolutely 100% must be empirical. Relentlessly so. You can't just guess or rely on intuition. You have to get out there, talk to specific potential users, like really talk to them, understand their workflow, their pains, watch them work if you can, and then you measure their reaction to everything you show them.
Be scientific about it.
Basically, yes. And how do you know when you've actually hit on something, when you found that initial spark? The sources mention a really convincing sign. The best answer to how do you know people want this is often something like, because we want it, our friends want it, and look, they're already using our clunky prototype. That early, eager usage, even of something imperfect, that's gold.
So you don't need millions of users right away. You need some users who are really enthusiastic.
Exactly. You need to find what the sources call a larval market.
A larval market. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a tiny, concentrated group of users who have the problem you're solving so badly, so urgently, that they'll put up with a buggy, incomplete product from a company nobody's ever heard of just to get some kind of solution. They're desperate.
Find the desperate few. That feels way more achievable than trying to boil the ocean from day one. It's like your beachhead.
It is. And it gives you that crucial first set of users to learn from, to iterate with, to build momentum from. Without them, you're just guessing in the dark.
Okay, makes sense. So you've found a real problem. You build something that this larval market seems to want. How do you actually kickstart the growth, get the engine turning? It doesn't just happen right.
No, it definitely doesn't. And this is where probably one of the most famous bits of advice comes in. You have to do things that don't scale.
Do things that don't scale.
Right.
Right. That sounds kind of backward for a company trying to achieve scale.
It does. If you think like a big company, it's totally inefficient. But startups need that initial manual push, like hand cranking an old car engine.
So what's an example?
The most common one is manually recruiting users. You can't just put up a website and expect a flood of signups. Early on, you often have to go out and personally find and persuade your first users, one by one.
Like the stories about Stripe, the Collison brothers literally installing the software for their first users.
Exactly. Or Airbnb founders going door to door in New York, taking photos of apartments themselves, helping people list.
Yeah, crazy manual effort.
Totally crazy. And impossible for Stripe or Airbnb to do now. But it was absolutely necessary to get those first crucial users on board, to learn from them directly, and to provide a level of service that just blew them away and turned them into fans.
Why do founders resist this, though? It seems logical you need users, but people seem hesitant to do that hand-to-hand combat.
Well, the sources suggest a few reasons. Sometimes it's just, shyness or maybe laziness. It's way more comfortable coding or planning strategy than potentially getting rejected by strangers.
Real.
But a bigger thing is often underestimating that power of compounding we talked about. Adding 5 users manually this week feels small, insignificant, if you're only thinking short term.
But if that manual effort gets you to 5% or 10% weekly growth, Suddenly, those small additions are the fuse lighting a much bigger rocket later on.
Exactly right. And it's not just about getting users. It's also about delighting those early users, like
Yeah.
giving them an experience that's ridiculously, unexpectedly good.
Going way beyond just a functional product, an insanely great experience.
Yes. Think about Wufoo, an early YC company. They famously sent handwritten thank you notes to their first users, or founders literally going to a user's office or home to watch them use the product. Not just for bug hunting, but to deeply understand their whole world and how your product fits in or doesn't.
That level of personal touch. A big company just can't do that.
And that's the startup superpower. Embrace being small. Don't try to act like a big, impersonal corporation. Overwhelm your first users with care and attention. They'll become your biggest advocates.
Sometimes doing things that don't scale might also mean starting really narrow, even if the big vision is huge.
Yep. Creating a contained fire, like Facebook starting only at Harvard,
Mhm.
or PayPal focusing intensely on eBay power sellers initially. Serve a small, specific group really well, get traction, learn, perfect it, then expand.
And for hardware startups,
It might mean pulling a Meraki, literally assembling the first batch of devices yourself in the office, understand the nuts and bolts, get product out faster.
or for B2B, maybe you act almost like a consultant for your very first big client, tailoring everything manually until it's perfect for them before you try to productize it more broadly.
Exactly. You learn so much by doing that. And then there's the even more extreme version, being your software.
Being your software, what does that mean?
It means you manually do the work behind the scenes that your software will eventually automate. Maybe you're taking orders via email and processing them by hand before you build the full e-commerce backend. It lets you launch super fast, validate the core idea, and you learn exactly what the software needs to do because you've been doing it.
Okay, so lots of unscalable things that do work early on. What about things founders try that usually don't work, according to these sources?
Two big ones get called out. First, the big launch. Big press release, TechCrunch coverage, aiming for a huge splash on day one.
Yeah, seems like the goal sometimes.
But the sources argue it's mostly ineffective. People are busy. They're not waiting breathlessly for your announcement. What matters way more is how happy you make the users you do manage to get, not some fleeting headline.
Makes sense. Focus on substance over splash. What's the other one?
Big partnerships with large companies. Signing a deal with Megacorp Inc. sounds impressive.
Right, instant credibility, maybe distribution.
That's the hope. But in reality, these deals often take forever, involve tons of meetings, and deliver very little real value, especially early on. Big companies just move slow and have their own agendas. Relying on them for your initial traction is usually a mistake.
Okay, so the big takeaway here seems to be a startup idea isn't just the what. It's like a vector. It's the what plus the how you're going to manually push it forward initially.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that founding is serious work. It's not just about having a clever idea or raising money. You got to roll up your sleeves and do the unscalable stuff to get momentum.
Speaking of raising money, let's shift gears. When you do get to the point of talking to investors, maybe experienced ones like at Y Combinator, how should you approach that conversation?
Yeah, the advice here is pretty strong. Don't try to put on a show. Don't try to present this polished, perfect facade where you pretend you have everything figured out.
So no slick sales pitch.
Less about the slick pitch, more about letting the actual substance of your startup, your progress, your understanding, your honesty do the talking.
What are investors like that really looking for?
The sources boil it down to basically three things. 1, formidable founders. 2, a promising market, one that has the potential to be huge. And 3, evidence of success, which usually means traction, ideally demonstrated by growth.
Okay, formidable founders. What does that actually mean, especially if you're, say, young or don't have a long track record?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean being loud or aggressive. It means seeming like the kind of person or team that finds a way to get things done no matter the obstacles. And for founders without a lot of experience, the best way to signal that is often just by sticking rigorously to the truth.
So trying to fake confidence or pretend you know more than you do, that's going to backfire.
Almost certainly. Experienced investors, especially VCs, are described as being like professional bullshit detectors. They see pitches all day long. If you try to mimic some swagger you saw somewhere, but it's not authentic, it just rings false, comes across as insincere or worse.
What if they ask you something you don't know? Or about big risks or competitors? You can't just ignore those.
Absolutely not. The advice is be upfront. If you don't know, say, I don't know, but here's how we'd figure that out. Be candid about risks. Talk openly about competitors, who they are, how you're different, where they're strong, where they're weak.
But doesn't admitting weaknesses make you look bad?
Not usually to smart investors. They know every startup has risks and competitors. That's the nature of the game. Pretending they don't exist makes you look naive or like you're hiding something. Showing you understand the landscape, warts and all, actually builds credibility.
Interesting. The YC interview process is famously short, right? Like 10
Right.
minutes. How does this truthfulness thing play out there?
Yeah, those interviews aren't really about delivering a perfect, memorized pitch. They're designed for the partners to dig in quickly, ask tough questions, and importantly, to see if they can learn something from you. If you're deeply knowledgeable about your users and your market, and you're communicating that honestly, you basically become a temporary domain expert for them. That's super compelling.
So the goal is to teach them about your corner of the world based on real experience.
Exactly. Now, raising money gives you runway, right? Time before the cash runs out. But is there such a thing as raising too much money early on?
Good question. Seems like more money is always better.
You'd think so, but the sources suggest raising too much too early can actually cause problems. Not the money itself, but what often comes with it.
Like what?
Well, pressure to spend it, maybe unwisely. Hiring too fast, which ironically often slows things down because of coordination overhead and training.
Right, adding people adds complexity.
Yeah, moving into fancy, expensive offices too soon. Prematurely introducing office politics. And maybe the biggest one. It can make it harder to pivot, to change direction because you have more inertia, more stakeholders, higher burn rate.
So it can actually hinder the agility that makes startups special.
It can, yeah. It can pull founders away from that intense heads-down focus on product and users that's so critical in the early days.
Okay, and what about investor rejections? They happen all the time. How should founders handle that?
The advice is basically, don't waste energy trying to convince the ones who said no. Move on. The best investors, the ones who find the truly huge outliers, they often care less about who else is investing. They're making their own judgment.
So don't play the social proof game too much.
Right. And if you are asked about rejections, be honest. Explain why you think that other investor was maybe mistaken about the market, the approach, whatever. If you can articulate that clearly and genuinely believe it, that conviction, that honesty can actually make you seem more formidable to the right investor who sees what others missed.
So whether it's users or investors, it keeps coming back to substance, truthfulness, and deeply understanding your reality.
Absolutely. Build something real, know it inside out, and talk about it plainly. That seems to be the common thread.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the founder's journey itself. The ongoing process, the mindset. A key idea mentioned is release early.
Yeah, get that first version out fast. Version 1, minimal but stable.
Minimal but stable. Not perfect.
Definitely not perfect. The thinking is users will tolerate missing features if the core works, and they see you're improving it constantly. What they hate are bugs and instability. Plus, you just can't really know your users or how they'll react until you actually release something to them.
And once it's out there, you don't just sit back. You got to keep pumping out features.
Right, continuous improvement. Iterate, iterate, iterate. The sources compare it to exercise. It keeps the product development muscle strong, generates new ideas. And it's actually a form of marketing.
Yeah.
Users love sites and apps that visibly get better all the time, especially if it feels like their feedback is being heard.
Creates momentum. And all of this, the releasing, the iterating, it all serves the main goal, make users happy.
At the end of the day, yeah, that's the win in your sales. You got to design for that typical user who lands on your page or opens your app, maybe slightly skeptical, finger hovering over the back button.
Got to grab them quick.
Yeah, explain clearly what you do, show them something useful or impressive right away, and measure. Track your conversion rates relentlessly. Are people sticking around? Are they doing the key actions? That tells you if you're actually making them happy enough.
With all this pressure, building, growing, funding, keeping users happy, what should founders actually worry about? What are the real dangers?
Fear the right things is the phrase used. Don't spend too much energy fearing competitors. Fear internal problems more.
Like what?
The single worst mistake, apparently, founders ignoring their users, just billing what they think is cool without validating it. Also, major internal disputes, especially between co-founders, and just inertia. Getting stuck, unable to make decisions or move fast enough, that's the stuff that kills startups from the inside.
So the internal dynamics and staying connected to users are more critical than the external threats.
That's the argument. And navigating all this requires a specific kind of persistence. It's described as being determined, not stubborn.
Determined, not stubborn. What's the difference there?
Think of a running back in American football. Their goal is the end zone. That's your growth goal. They are absolutely determined to get there, but they don't just run straight ahead into a wall of defenders.
Right? They dodge, they weave, they change direction.
Exactly. They're flexible, improvising based on the obstacles in front of them. That's your user feedback, market changes, competitor moves. You adapt your path constantly, but you never stop driving towards the goal. Stubbornness is just banging your head against the same obstacle repeatedly.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, and a practical tip for dealing with outside parties, like potential investors or acquirers.
Yeah, assume every deal will fall through until the ink is dry and the money's in the bank.
Oh, pessimistic, but probably realistic.
It forces you to keep hustling, keep pursuing other options, which is always good. And paradoxically, not needing the deal gives you more leverage in negotiating it.
Right. And co-founder relationships. You mentioned disputes.
Hugely critical. The advice is choose co-founders extremely carefully. Most blowups aren't really about the business situation. They're about the people, the personalities, the dynamic. If you have doubts about someone early on, don't ignore them. It's way easier to not start a company with the wrong person than to fix a broken co-founder relationship later.
So really, choosing to be a founder is committing to a pretty unique, challenging path.
It really is. You're basically signing up to tackle a harder type of problem than most businesses face. You're searching for these rare, non-obvious ideas that can actually generate that rapid growth curve. It's almost framed like being an economic research scientist.
A research scientist.
Yeah, you're running experiments in the real world, in the market. You're testing hypotheses about user needs and how to meet them at scale. There's no guarantee you'll find a breakthrough, but you're committed to that process of discovery through building and learning.
That's a powerful way to think about it. Now, finally, the sources briefly touch on something that happens after a startup gets big. A later stage challenge.
Yeah, this emerging idea of founder mode.
Founder mode. Okay, what's that about?
Well, as companies grow really large, the conventional management wisdom, hire great VPs, set up clear org charts, delegate everything, give people autonomy. That stuff often works well for professional CEOs brought in later, but it can actually be kind of disastrous for the founder who's still running the company. That standard manager mode might not fit.
So founders who stay and scale successfully, they operate differently.
That's the idea that seems to be emerging. Successful founder CEOs of large companies often seem to stay involved much more deeply across more parts of the company than typical management theory would suggest. They might use unconventional methods. The example given is Steve Jobs pulling key people into strategy retreats, regardless of where they sat on the official org chart.
So it's a different way of leading, less hierarchical maybe, more driven by the founder's deep connection to the product and vision.
Possibly. It's still not super well defined, something founders are figuring out, often by trial and error. And sometimes, when they operate in this founder mode, they can seem eccentric or maybe even difficult to people used to more traditional corporate structures.
But the results might justify the different approach.
That's the suggestion. There might be a distinct, effective way for founders to lead even very large companies that we're still learning about.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what are the big takeaways for you listening to this, maybe thinking about starting something or leading a growing venture?
Well, this deep dive into Paul Graham's insights really hammers home a few core things. First, the absolute lifeblood, the defining characteristic of a startup, isn't just being new, it's the relentless pursuit of rapid growth.
And that growth doesn't just magically appear from a great idea. It's built, especially early on, through deliberate, hard, often unglamorous, unscalable work. Stuff like talking to users one by one, manually getting things done.
And it's all centered on intensely understanding and delighting those initial users, making something they genuinely want and then making them incredibly happy they found it.
Plus, there's this thread of radical honesty, right? Being truthful with yourself about what's working, being truthful with users, being truthful with investors, no hiding, no faking it.
Absolutely. And maintaining that unique blend of determination always driving forward, but also flexibility, willingness to adapt and change course based on reality, like that running back.
The whole journey sounds like constant learning, constant iteration, driven by that weekly growth pulse.
It really is. The path to building something massive seems paved with countless small, difficult, but essential steps at the beginning. And then, if you succeed and scale, the leadership challenge evolves again, maybe requiring you to invent your own founder mode that leverages your unique history, but breaks conventional rules.
So it's not just building a company, it's embracing this specific methodology, this challenging, iterative, almost scientific process of discovering value in the market. searching for that breakthrough.
Exactly. It's a demanding framework, but a powerful one if rapid growth is your goal. It cuts through a lot of the noise and focuses on what truly matters.
A great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.